Welcome guys to the first in our partition commemoration series called Sarhad Paar, which translates to Beyond the Border. We will be in discussion with Dr Radha Kapuria, and we'll be exploring the impact of the partition of India in 1947 on the musicians of newly divided Punjab. So how did the partition of India affect music in India, Pakistan and the diaspora, wherever they may be in the world? So a really exciting session. I thought I would get everybody warmed up by playing some music from the 1940s. So we've got Surinder Kaur, Longavacha. Really excited for this session actually, because it's covering music and history, two of my very favourite themes, and Sukhman's of course as well. So I'll just give it a few more minutes. Hi Prabjot, long time. I hope you can stick around for this session, because obviously you're a musician as well. I think you'll enjoy it. Hi Bobby, thank you for the appreciation. So I usually dress according to the theme, so because we're discussing Punjab, my jhunkis are representing Punjab in jewellery form. So I'll give it about a minute or two, let a few more people join. As I said, we'll be discussing the impact of partition on the musicians, the partition of India 1947, the impact and legacy on the musicians of newly divided Punjab, with Dr Radha Kapuria, who I will introduce shortly. So let's just give it another minute or so. Oh, don't want this to play. Let's rewind that. That's much better. So I hope you can all stick around for the rest of the hour. And for those that are not familiar with the format of these series, so we're celebrating South Asian Heritage Month, and Sarhad Paar, or Beyond the Border, is our series commemorating the partition of India, or the independence of India and Pakistan, 1947, which we celebrate or commemorate 14th and 15th August annually for the last 70 years or so. So yes, the format. So I'll introduce Radha for those that are not aware of who she is. Then we'll move on to a rapid fire round, which is just an icebreaker, some fun and games, and move on to the conversation, which will last 40 to 45 minutes. Towards the end, the last 15-20 minutes, usually I allow you guys, so the viewers, to ask questions to the guest. I'll just turn the music off now. So that, like I said, that's the format for the hour. I will disable the comments now when I invite Radha into this space to have the conversation, and that's just to allow us to have a unfiltered conversation without distraction. But by all means, please do engage with the conversation. You can drop your comments in the comments box at the bottom, even if I've disabled them from my point of view, from my side. They will reappear when I enable the comments at the end. So yeah, if you have any questions, please share them now, or like I said, towards the end, the last 15-20 minutes. We'll try and get through as many as possible. It has happened once or twice before where we've had to go over the session slightly over an hour. If that happens, I'll let you know. So yeah, save your questions for then if you're not able to get it done within this hour. So without further ado, let's introduce Radha, Dr. Radha Kapuria. And the topic again, for those that have just joined, is the impact of partition 1947 on the musicians of newly divided Punjab. So Dr. Radha Kapuria has her family roots in West Punjab, which is in current-day Pakistan. Radha grew up in the historic city of Delhi in India, where she graduated from the University of Delhi with a master's degree in history in 2009. She then took a year off to campaign for sustainable, safe food and holistic agricultural practices. Moving from agriculture to culture, she researched the Harballabh festival, which is North India's oldest classical music festival, for her MPhil degree at the prestigious Centre for Historical Studies in New Delhi's Jawaharlal Nehru University. Radha went on to pursue her PhD at King's College London in 2018 as a Commonwealth Scholar from India, so 2014 to 2017, and later as Isabel Thornley Doctoral Fellow at the IHR in London, 2017 to 2018. She's currently the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in History at Sheffield University, 2019 to 2022, on the project Subverting Borders, Musicians, Nationalism and Memory in Punjab, 1947 to 1991, which maps the impact of South Asia's partition in 1947 on the musicians of newly divided Punjab. And that's the topic we'll be discussing today. Her main research interests are in South Asian social, cultural and gender history, migration, displacement and borderlands, conflict, decolonisation and culture, and the political and historical context of cultural expression more generally. So that's just a little background into who Dr. Radha Kapuria is. I'm just going to turn off the comments now and invite Radha to the conversation. Just give me a minute. Oh, why is it not coming up? Okay, this has never happened before. I'm not able to go live with Radha. Let's turn on the comments again. Sorry guys, like I said, it's first time for everything. Radha, if you are there, could you just send an invite, because I'm not able to invite you to the conversation from my end, which is at first, like I said. Hi Amandeep, glad you could join us this evening. So Radha, if you could just send an invitation, because I'm, for some strange reason, not able to send you one. Which is odd, because that has never happened before. Let's try again, refresh. No, it's not letting me do that. Really apologies for this, guys. She was live. Perhaps she's not here. No, cannot send her a message. Right. Let's try again. One more time. If not, we're going to have to start this session again. I'm going to have to send her a message. Ah, there we are. Let's see if she can join now. Perhaps she's not here. We just spoke a moment ago. Should I sing in this section to pass the time? No, okay. Sorry guys, let me just... We did literally just spoke a moment. Ah, there she is. Right, she had not joined. Now I can. Thank you guys for your patience. Really appreciate that. First time for everything, hey. Hi Radha.
Hi Noor.
I'm not sure what happened there, but we were all eagerly waiting for your arrival. So glad that it worked out now.
Yeah.
So I've introduced you. For those that are not aware of who you are, let me just disable the comments again. So for those that just joined, I did explain that I do normally disable the comments during the course of the conversation. Towards the end, the last 15-20 minutes, I enable them, and then you guys can share comments, feedback, questions later on. So the last 15-20 minutes. So Radha, how are you? You okay?
Yes. Good,
Yes.
good to be
Really
here.
excited for this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. I cannot wait. It's such a pleasure to speak to you. I really admire your work and your sister's work. I love your music. So
thank you so much. You know, I mean, the feeling is mutual. I'm so honored that you were able to join us. When I reached out to you, it was fairly last minute, and you know, you still gave me the time. You know, we spoke beforehand, so I really do appreciate it. I know you're an extremely busy person, so I value the time that you've taken out this evening, and really hope that everyone, you know, enjoys this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. So let's dive right in, Radha. Like I said, we usually start with a rapid fire round, an icebreaker. So no pressure. There are no right or wrong answers. It's fun. First question. So if you had the opportunity to be a fly on the wall, during any episode in any element of world history, what moment or time period would that be?
Oh, without a doubt, it would be during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's reign, and especially during the musical and dance performances that he would host. So I'd like to be a silent spectator and see
I
what
would
he
love
said
to
to
be.
the musicians and dancers, and check whether all the stories and all the affines are actually correct, or yeah, I would love to be
Yeah.
there.
Well, interesting, because my final question, so we got 3 questions rapid fire round, was actually, if you could ask Ranjit Singh any question, what might that be? So perhaps you can go ahead and answer that now. If you had the opportunity, sitting in front of you, you're in a time machine, Ranjit and Radha in conversation, what
Oh,
would you have?
wow.
Only one question you can ask him. What would that be?
Well, that would be a dream come true, to actually chat to the man. Gosh, I'm fighting between my boring historian self and my juicy, gossipy
Yeah.
self. I don't know. I suppose I would ask him to give me a list of his favorite, songs and dance performances and sort of musical pieces, and I would also ask him how much he pays all his entire karkhana of musicians and dancers. So what the budget was. That's the historian self.
Yeah, no, great. I'm glad that you answered that question, and you were honest about it. You'd want to revel in some gossip. Why not? Right, final question of the rapid fire round. So you're having a dinner party. Which 3 personalities, living or dead, would you invite?
Oh, God, that's a difficult one.
Does Ranjit Singh?
Well, I already had a chance to meet him, so
Yeah. Cancel that one out.
Maybe one would be Noor Khan, who was this spy and this wonderful woman, who also came from a family of musicians, and her grandfather was from Punjab, or from Haryana and Punjab. So that would be interesting. And she was a spy in World War II, so that would be like make for great conversation.
Isn't it? Yeah.
Who else? Gosh. Maybe Akbar, the Emperor Akbar from the medieval ages. And perhaps Bibi Mora from Ranjit Singh's time, his first courtesan wife, whom he was deeply in love with. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you
Ranjit
for that,
Singh.
Ram.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Hopefully that gives people a bit more insight into, who you are, what your interests are. Clearly, Ranjit Singh, and that time period. So let's move on now to the question. So, your PhD offers the first social history of music in colonial Punjab, so from 1849 to 1947. So my question has 2 strands to it. What was the inspiration for this research, firstly, and why do you think this theme hadn't been explored before?
Thank you. So I think the reason I chose to study this is to do with partition, actually, because I grew up as a Punjabi in Delhi in India. And, I grew up with all these songs, which I soon discovered were sung across the border as well on weddings. And so I was very curious about this really strong cultural link, which I wanted to know what lay behind it, like where its roots sort of lay and what the history of this was. So I said, if I need to study what happened after partition, I need to study what happened before partition. So it's kind of like going back in time.
Yeah.
And I think Ranjit Singh was never part of the PhD, but I just found so much material on his reign. I thought it would be like 2 pages on the background to British rule and colonial rule, but there was just so much. So it became an entire chapter, and the courtesans and the musicians he employed. I mean, he was such a big patron of the arts. And what was the second question? Sorry.
Why do you think that this theme hadn't been explored before? The legacy or impact of partition on music.
Yeah, I think the reasons are like so many reasons. I think the main reason would be it has to do with partition and how, because of the borders, our sense of Punjabi identity on the Indian side and on the Pakistani side is so fractured. And, you know, this sense of what was there pre-partition is lost, and which has prevented people from attempting to research undivided Punjab as an entity. So I think it's the legacy of partition which perhaps explains why people haven't studied this period in colonial. The other reason is that historians don't think music or musicians is a serious enough topic of study. But people have, you know, when I started out, people had done studies of South India and Bengal and Maharashtra. And, you know, so one of the only regions which seemed to be left out in the north was Punjab. And, you know, with good
That's
reason.
interesting. I mean, there's two key things that you've highlighted there. The first one is the Punjab was left out of this conversation, this musical conversation, which we will explore in a moment. But the other thing about history that you said, and histories are usually about conflict, generally are about conflict and war. Cultural stories are usually forgotten. Because largely they are oral stories, so you rely on people to share. And something like partition is a very sensitive, very fragile, triggering topic, and it's not something people can easily talk about. I know from my own example, I did my thesis at university was on the partition of India. So I did a politics degree, and I wanted to ask my Nanaji some questions, and he was a historian himself. He did a master's in the Russian Revolution, and that was the first time I saw him shout at me, and he didn't want to talk about it. And I thought, oh, he's very rude. You know, why is he not talking about it? But I didn't know. I was naive and completely ignorant to the sensitivities, the emotional sensitivities of this topic. And when I delved deeper, I realized that he was right. He was right to respond in that way. I would have loved to have spoken to him. He's not around anymore, but I couldn't pry that out of him, that information. And that's largely why a lot of these stories don't get archived and do not get shared. But there are initiatives like the 1947 Partition Archive in India that are working to capture these memories, because obviously this was 70 odd years ago. People who were alive at that time, they're very old now, and we're relying on memories which might not be very strong. I think there's all these different factors. So, you know, cultural histories are usually omitted from the larger historical narrative, right? But the other thing you said about Punjab was left out of the narrative, the musical narrative, and I just want to touch on your research that you did, which was and I mentioned in the bio, the Harballabh Sangeet Sammelan, which is North India's most, you know, it's the oldest classical music festival in Jalandhar, Punjab, so that's East Punjab. It's interesting that is the center of music in entire you know, subcontinent of India. But Punjab is now not seen as the center of excellence for music. And there's a few things that I just wanted to share, and then I'll let you elaborate on that. So, you know, we understand Punjab is a site of folk music. We hear in lots of modern Bhangra or Punjabi songs reference about Punjab, Guruan Pina di Dharti, Panj Darya di Dharti, these type of things. It's the land of Sufi music, Baba Bulle Shah, Farid, Qawwali, Nusrat. Folk music, Surinder Kaur, you know, Noor Jehan, the list goes on, endless list. But also, more importantly, I would say, if we think about what came out of Punjab, thus the Sikh faith came out of Punjab, the scripture, the Guru Granth Sahib, is completely made to a musical mode.
Yes.
Yet, Punjab is not seen as that center of excellence. We've got Banaras, Lucknow, Patiala Gharana is something which is reputable, Bade Ghulam Ali Khan's Gharana. So my question to you is, why is that? Why did Punjab get left out, considering that the Harballabh festival is such a vital part of music in India and is situated in Punjab? How did Punjab get left behind?
Thank you. I think, and you know, it may seem too simplistic to keep coming back to partition, but it does seem to be the most plausible reason, because in a sense, with the sort of fracturing of Punjab in 47, as I said earlier, Lahore was the center of cultural excellence. It still is in many ways, but in undivided Punjab, it was really strong. And classical music has always thrived in Punjab and did thrive at that time. But after 47, because of this division into Indian Punjab and Pakistani Punjab, the two Punjabs kind of took parallel trajectories. So in a sense, Indian Punjab, as Virinder Kalra has argued, Indian Punjab came to be seen as representative of folk music. And in Pakistan, it was more Qawwali and Ghazal. And in all this classical music, which is in a sense the connecting bridge between all of these forms of music, isn't it? Because many of these folk musicians and these Qawwali or film or pop musicians have all had training, have had classical training. So you mentioned Madam Noor Jehan, who was this famous film and ghazal singer, and she trained with Ustad Bade Ghulam Ali Khan of the Patiala Gharana. So in a sense, Patiala, as you said, it's the one gharana which has become representative of Punjab. But there are so many others. Those of us who study music, those of us who know about it or engage with music would know that there's Sham Chorasi and Talwandi and so many other gharanas. But in a sense, this Patiala gharana emerges as the strongest. And in a sense, the history of the Patiala gharana is also connected. It's also emerged from connections to Lahore. And the reason they don't have a Lahore gharana, for example, is because after after Ranjit Singh's empire was sort of, when Lahore was annexed by the East India Company in 1849, in a sense, all these musicians had to flee to neighboring princely courts like Jaipur or Jammu, So, and from Jaipur, the musicians then went to Patiala. So the people, Behram Khan, who migrated from Lahore, his disciples then trained the people who now represent the Patiala Gharana. So in a sense, Patiala comes to absorb these different lineages from across Punjab. I think it's to do with this sense of partition, fracturing a sense of Punjab being a center of classical music. And this conversation being highlighted less and less because of partition. Yeah.
I mean, interestingly, now we associate Punjab, like you said, with folk music, but largely I would say Bhangra music, which is another topic in itself. I mean,
yes,
I'm not a fan of the music that's coming out of Punjab anymore, but like you said, West Punjab is mainly known for representing Sufi Qawwali ghazals.
Yes.
And East Punjab, not so much anymore. And I think you mentioned before that the sort of advent of the Green Revolution was also like a turning point in terms of music, and how the emphasis changed. Was it because of that was the Green Revolution to do with agricultural boost in Punjab? So then the music became sort of diluted. Is that something you would agree with, or?
Death knell. We seem to have lost her, Noor.
Hi. It's come back now.
Yes. So I was saying the Green Revolution is perhaps the final death knell in a sense. The process began with British rule much earlier, because the people who the new British rulers kind of saw Punjab in this very rural sense, and they did inaugurate this sense of intensive agriculture. Which is seen to represent Punjab. So Punjab was a land of forests, and it was far more fluid. But with colonial rule, there was this view that Punjabis and Jat Sikhs are peasants. So the peasant image became very, very prominent during this colonial period, and it was seen as this very rural, bucolic landscape. So the roots are older, but of course one needs to study Ranjit Singh and pre-Ranjit Singh to see if it's fair to say that it came entirely with British rule, or was there an earlier rustic idea of Punjab?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, the fact that the Guru Granth Sahib, the Sikh scripture, sacred Sikh scripture, is entirely composed, to Hindustani classical music. I think that speaks volumes about music in Punjab, and it's completely diluted now. People don't even learn Rag Kirtan. Rag Kirtan is something that not a lot of people know about. Even my own journey, I was learning Rag Kirtan from young age. I didn't even know I was learning Rag Kirtan until I was, in my early 20s. And, I think my personal opinion is people like Sadhguru Jagjit Singh of the Nantari sect, he helped to revive
Yes,
classical music. He
very
gave it
true.
that respect once again. What Punjab used to be. It used to be a place that people would flock to learn. Even Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, I know, went to Amritsar, went to Darbar Sahib.
Hmm.
It was known as this center of learning, and unfortunately now it's just Bhangra music, which isn't
Yeah,
even that great anymore.
yeah,
I want to move on to something else rather. This, your whole study, your academic sort of research, it's very important in the academics today that you're investigating this. Like you said, it's not something that's been researched before. So I guess my question is, how do we filter this down beyond the academic realm
hmm.
and onto a grassroots level for the general populace, whether they're in Pakistan, India, the diasporic community? I know, for example, in the UK, we've got the Mardana project by Kirat Singh,
Hmm.
Jasdeep Singh. This is something that they're exploring. Hopefully, we'll get to see that documentary soon. That's them looking into the impact of partition, the fractures it caused in music, and specifically the Rababi Kirtan tradition. But Punjabis as a community, whether they're from the East or West Punjab, they need to own these stories. How do you go about doing this?
Hmm.
Moving it beyond academia.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. And I think the sort of motivations of all of us who are doing this research is more than just one person doing this research. So in a sense, as we approach the 75th anniversary of partition in 2022, which is 2 years from now, we need to actually maybe put forces together and kind of speak about, there is no memorial honoring those who died. A sort of
Yeah.
memorial which honors both Indians and Pakistanis, because if we speak of memorials, it's always very polarized. But partition was an event where both sides were implicated, and there needs to be a reckoning with that, scarring, with the trauma. And because both governments benefit from this state of conflict, they won't invest in something like this. So it has to be a sort of transnational kind of diasporic attempt, perhaps, to put a memorial on the border which commemorates the dead, because otherwise, it's the musicians and the cultural figures who have to do the labor of healing these wounds. It's through the music and all these YouTube comments and, oh, I'm an Indian, but I love the music of Pakistan, or and this kind of, and even going to concerts and saying, oh, we are all the same. And there's a way in which people try, but there's no resolution to that sense of. So we need to actually do something at a policy level to address the wounds of partition, because otherwise it just keeps regurgitating and feeding into these very violent narratives.
Something that you said there, Radha, I'm sorry to interject there. You're talking about YouTube comments, and we spoke about this before. Let's take Coke Studio India versus Coke Studio Pakistan, for example. And when I go on the comments, as we do sometimes, you see the politics entering that space of music. The politics of partition still exist in the same way it does with sport. So cricket, whenever India and Pakistan are playing, I don't need to say any more on that. We know it's such a heated moment for both fans, and it's just interesting how. I guess what I'm trying to say is, on the one hand we say that music connects, music, goes beyond borders, gender, and all that kind of stuff. But this is really interesting. If you could comment on that, the way I've seen it is, yes, there is that aspect. It does have the ability to connect. I'll give you an example. When Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan came to Southall, I think in the 70s or 80s, you can see the YouTube videos. When the camera pans to the audience, you can see people, Punjabis, Sardars, you can see Hindus, you can see Muslims, everybody. Saanjha Punjab is sitting in that room. Undivided Punjab exists in that room with
Yes.
Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. So there's that argument. But then we see the other side of the argument where, like I said, online, and you mentioned Coke Studio isn't one example in terms of if you talk about music, that rivalry is still there. It's very, very strong. People saying India music is better, Pakistan music is better. That's just something I've noticed.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could elaborate on that.
I mean, the basic thing is it's not different kinds of music, despite the separate sort of, largely separate histories of the last 70 years. It's basically the same music. It's nothing different. It's the same tradition. It's the same way you train. So it's the same music. It's South Asian music. It's Hindustani or Ragdari classical music. And the question about, sorry, I seem to have lost what was the main question you asked? Sorry.
So if we talk about music, on the one hand, we're saying that music has the ability to connect.
Is music being political? Yes. So thanks. Yeah. So I think this is the conundrum with music, because at one level we're saying that musicians are the ones who are bridging the gap, and they're performing this emotional labor of connecting people and, putting a balm on the wounds of partition. But at the same time, some of the same musicians also sing nationalist songs which glorify the wars against each country. Whether it's Lata Mangeshkar or Noor Jehan or so many others, or Atif Aslam, there's countless on both sides, So, and this sense of music being political is very visible in India today, where so many, famous Bollywood musicians from Sonu Nigam to Abhijit, etc., are espousing this very anti-Pakistani musician stand, and it's really alarming, and it's really inexplicable. It makes no sense. And this sort of sectarian agenda where sometimes, a musician, Amjad Sabri, the Qawwal, was assassinated in Pakistan in 2016. So music is political as well, and which is why we find such heated comments, I suppose, and heated reactions and saying, is Indian music better or Pakistani better? But the point is, if you go back just one generation, most of these musicians were taught by the same teachers. So they're united by the Gharana system, which itself goes back to post 1857. So, so there is such a common legacy there. And I think my research, the current sort of aim of my research is to, as you said, not look at the history of the conflict, because that is done to death, but to actually explore this history of connection, and to argue that, despite this rigid border between India and Pakistan after 1947, musicians are the ones who kept crossing it more than any other group, because so many musicians had their ustad, their guru, on the other side of the border. So not just for learning, but also for performing. And there's, so many patrons and so many music clubs which would host musicians. And there are really amazing stories of people subverting the visa regime and smuggling in a musician just so they could perform. And there's all these really, Robin Hood style stories of.
I want to get into that, specifically with regards to Bade Ghulam Ali Khan. So that moves us very nicely onto my next question, which is about ownership and musical identities. And that conversation will come in really nicely there. So we talk about Noor Jehan, Surinder Kaur, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. So Surinder Kaur, for example, she was born in Lahore, pre-partition Lahore. She was born in. She got married in 1948. They moved to Delhi in 1947, and she got married in 1948. But in 1943, her and her sister Prakash Kaur became very famous. I think for the song Madhaniya. I can remember, or was it Mama Tetiam? No, it was Mama Tetiam, sorry, in 1943. And I often wonder, she was known as the Quail of Punjab, the Nightingale of Punjab. Now, this was subsequent
to the Quit India movement.
After partition it was. So I wonder, does West Punjab remember Surinder Kaur? So that's just sort of one question.
Yes.
But the other one, I'm just going to look at my notes that I've made here. As I mentioned, Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, when he came to Southall, the audience was made up of saanjha Punjab. So everyone is simultaneously enjoying the sound of Punjab. There's no discrimination in that room, but I'm Pakistani, you're Hindustan. None of that. It completely disappears. But if we think about Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, he was a citizen of both countries at one point. 10 years of Pakistan, 10 years of India.
Yes.
If you could talk about that, because I think that's such an interesting story how both countries tried to lay claim to him as a musician.
So I think I'll start with the Surinder Kaur question. I don't know. It's a good question. We can ask people if the memory of Prakash Kaur in West Punjab. But there are similar stories of, for example, Iqbal Bano, who was one of the most famous ghazal singers of Pakistan. She was from Delhi, grew up in Rohtak, which is in Haryana. And then she left for Pakistan in 1952 when she was married to a gentleman in Multan. So her training was in the Delhi Gharana. So again, there's this continuous, movement of musicians. And so many female musicians moved because they were married, for example. Noor Jehan or Roshnara Begum, all of them said that they moved because their husbands had to move. So there's this very interesting kind of the reasons why people move as well. Some chose, some were forced. So Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, for example, his hometown was Kasur, which is the neighboring, the twin city with Lahore. So, and he is from the Kasur Patiala Gharana, and he was in Pakistan from 1947 to 57, which is exactly 10 years. And then he had a falling out with Mr. Bukhari, who was the head of Radio Pakistan, and he had an agenda for music which Bade Ghulam Ali Khan did not agree with. And at the same time, there were people in India who were very eager to invite and attract talent of such a big name like Bade Ghulam Ali. And so Morarji Desai, who may have questionable politics in other ways if we look at it today, but he had such an abiding love for music that he made sure Nehru was convinced, and he got Bade Ghulam Ali Khan to get Indian citizenship. And so that, and he died in 68, Bade Ghulam Ali Khan. So he was almost exactly a citizen of Pakistan and India for 10 years. And he once famously said that if every child in every home had learned classical music, India, undivided India, would not have been partitioned. So I think he was deeply hurt with this kind of new animosity and what partition brought in its wake.
Yeah, that is, as you mentioned, partition caused fractures. It was not just a geographical divide. It went beyond that. We're still suffering, in terms of, if we talk about Rag Kirtan, for example, even the Tanti Saj, the instruments, harmonium is now the instrument in every Gurdwara. For example, once upon a time, it would have been a sarangi, a stringed instrument, or dilruba, jodi, these types of instruments. They are coming back now. People are starting to learn about them, but they were the norm. They are now not the norm. Now, if you have a rag darbar, it's seen as something very novel, when it was just completely the normal thing of the time. So that's something I find really interesting. But I want to move on.
I think that would be something which would be more to do with not so much with partition, but more to do with the sense of modernity and just the ease of the harmonium. It had started, this is something which of course began in the colonial period, but then post, it became even more pronounced. But also, I mean, there are stories of Rababis who, during the violence of partition, like there is this gentleman called Talib Hussain, who went from East Punjab, and he was caught, he was a young boy, and he was caught in the riots, and he was from a Rababi family, and there were these violent Sikhs who were being violent to the Muslims, and this child was at risk of losing his life. He was with a group of other Rababis, but he had the courage to say, we sing the music of your scriptures, so you shouldn't kill us. And they said, oh, we don't believe you, but he sang something in Rag Asa, and that kind of convinced these violent people, and he could cross over to Pakistan.
Wow.
So there are stories like this as well, where in the kind of mayhem
Yeah.
of 47, music also saved some people. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Did not know that story. Got goosebumps actually. Yeah. Catch my breath there.
There are some interviews I can share on YouTube of the village he was from in India, of people remembering Tariq Hussain.
Yeah, please do. And then I can share that on my Insta story after for people to explore in their own time. I just want to move on, rather, looking at the time. We've got a couple of minutes before I enable the comments. I want to talk about something you mentioned earlier, and we've spoken about wedding songs. So there seems to be fluidity there in terms of Punjabi identity with regards to wedding songs. I just want to share with everybody my own personal example. We can talk about this for a few minutes. So I was performing Punjabi songs at my friend's lady singing. My friend is a Muslim friend from her parents. So her mom is from India, her dad is from Lahore. But then her mom's family were from India. They migrated to Pakistan, but her dad had always been in Pakistan, from Lahore. And so I was singing some Punjabi songs. One of them was Bale Bale Vitor Punjaban di Lathe di Chadar is my and at the end, a lot of her family members, my friend's family members, came up to me and said, "Asi vi ਇਹ ਸੁਣਦੇ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਸੀਗੇ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਤੂੰ ਜਦੋਂ ਗਾਉਂਦੀ ਸੀ it reminded us of our Punjab, of our home. How do you know these songs? ਇਹ ਸਾਡੇ ਇਲਾਕੇ ਦੇ ਗਾਣੇ ਆ." And I started crying because I was like, this has connected you. And at this time I was very naive. I wasn't aware of the impact of music. I was in my early 20s. I think I was still doing my degree. And I just found that fascinating, that they all and the Punjabi, we were speaking the same language, and this music, this song was just transporting them back to their childhood. And they would tell me how they would play Navera, the mum was making roti on the chulla, and then they would listen to this song. I could just visualize that scenery. But the interesting thing about Lathe di Chadar, for example, some of these songs, if we talk about Nusrat Nazir, Tufail Niazi, he sang Sada Chiri da Chamba, and Surinder Kaur sang Sada Chiri da Chamba. Surinder Kaur sang Longa Vacha. I played that at the beginning of this live, and so did Nusrat Nazir. She sang that. So there's a lot of these singers from both sides have sang the same songs, but the slight difference is in the wording. So when I was singing Lathe di Chadar, they said, "Oh, nahi, asin kade sunaya vi idda gaida hunda." And then I had to explain, well, where my family is from in Punjab, this is how they sing it. Different ilakas have different words. So asam, isma, si, tuthi, these are the slight differences which denote the area that you're from as well. So apart from that, they connected with that. That was another example of that Punjabi, that saanjha Punjab. And it was very emotional for me, and a very heartwarming moment that these folk songs could connect and with me, with a completely different generation. So you mentioned that as well earlier about wedding songs, and I find that interesting that they have the ability to do that. If you would like to talk about that, we've got a few minutes before we open the questions.
Thanks, Noor. That was such a lovely account of how these people from another generation responded to you singing these songs. And I think there's something to speak of gender here and women. And in colonial Punjab, in sort of 19th century, early 20th century, women used to, from all religions and all communities, they had certain rituals in which they would share. And the Siapa was one of them. There's this historian, Anshu Malhotra, who's worked on Punjab and gender, and she's shown how these male reformers of all religions sort of went after these practices which united women. And the Siapa was one of them, and it's still seen as a derogatory term, the Siapa. And Siapa is basically this mourning ritual where women would sort of beat their breasts very openly, you know, beat their chest and kind of on a death. And there were several other such rituals. And there are so many genres of wedding songs, like the Sitrani and of course the Takke, which we know. But the Sitranis were more lusty. And these have kind of over time been, you know, removed from the vocabulary, or they've been repurposed as religious songs by some of the Arya Samaji Hindu reformers, and similarly for the Sikh reformers. So there has been this attempt to change the culture. And I think the wedding songs is the one sphere where somehow, because a wedding is such an event, that some of these songs have survived. And which is why, so what I'm saying is that there was this very strong common culture which the women of the region enjoyed. And that's what explains the reason we remember these songs, whether it's Latte Di Chadar. And, you know, growing up in the 80s, there was also the cassette culture, which was, you know, the cassettes of Musarrat, her wedding songs were circulating in Delhi, where I grew up. So at my aunt's, my bua's wedding, those were so Musarrat is the one who was singing in the background. So it's the sense, that's the sense of Saanjha Punjab and Punjabiyat, which you know, you speak of.
I hadn't heard of her until I was in my 20s, and I think I was just on YouTube and I typed in Longa Bacha expecting Surinder Kaur to come up, and she came up and I thought, who's this? And then it was just, you know, leads you into another world, and I found that she's singing the songs that I've grown up singing, but this is a Pakistani woman. And immediately I did not feel any difference or any divide. It was, like I said, very emotional that this is the space where Saanjha Punjab exists. It lives in our hearts and minds. Yes, we can't get that back geographically, but it does exist in hearts and minds. It does exist. Where do you look for it? I look for it in music. And that's why music is so important for me, Punjabi music and devotional music. And, you know, I've been invited a few times to sing at events, Pakistani events. And, you know, when I see the face, the elation on their faces, when I'm singing songs that my family or Sikhs or Hindus would also enjoy, I can't really put that into words. It's just a wonderful feeling to see that. And as someone who performs and sings, you know, praise, claps, this kind of stuff, yeah, that's all fine. But when you see that, when you see this Punjab coming to life in that way, it's just wonderful. I guess that's the only way we will ever be able to continue to remember and enjoy pre-partition Punjab. And something I spoke to you about, even during my wedding, my Sangeet, I tried to recreate Saanjha Punjab. I had a theme which was Once Upon a Time in Punjab, and the music was all 1940s music, some modern music, and I had the tables, the centerpieces were the districts of Punjab or the different areas of Punjab. So we had Multan, we had Lahore, we had Batinda, for example. And everyone there, they felt, the elders particularly, they said, you know, we feel like we're transported to our childhood, and we remember the time when on Vaisakhi we would give, on Eid, we would give matiani to our neighbors, and they would do the same. So it's just something that's really important to me, and I know to a lot of people as well. You mentioned that earlier on that this is an initiative for the diaspora to continue to pick up, right? And they need to take this forward.
And I think the diaspora is important mainly because it's this neutral space where Punjabis of all nationalities can meet in a sort of, you know, whether it's in the UK or in Canada. And there's a very interesting story of musical, you know, soundtracks surviving and being revived thanks to the diaspora. And Ustad Zakir Hussain, who is, you know, of the Tabla Gharana, of the Punjab Gharana, his father, Ustad Allah Rakha, he used to, you know, compose music even for films. He was a classical musician who used to compose music for films. And one of the Punjabi films he composed the music for was called Madari in 1950. And this was in India, but the film was popular. This is just 3 years after partition, but it was popular in Pakistan as well. But many years later, when he tried to access the soundtrack, the only surviving copy had burnt in the film archives in Mumbai, in Bombay, and he couldn't lay hands on the music he had composed. So they tried to ask people in Pakistan, and no one could find any copy in Pakistan either. And then the only copy which could be found was located in Southall. So this is how these networks, and it went from Southall to Tooting, which is where Allah Rakha's daughter still lives. And then from Tooting, it went back to Bombay, where he was living. So, it took this long circuitous route, but this is how the diaspora kind of is so crucial. And
Southall in particular is known as mini Punjab, isn't it? So, it's interesting how the cassette ended up there, of all places. If it was meant to be anywhere, it was going to be in Southall, wasn't it?
Yes,
let's just look at some questions there, Radha. We've got 2 questions.
Yes.
Looking at the time, so let's get through them as quickly as possible. First one, what does the erasure of these lusty songs signify in terms of women's sexuality during the time? Can Radha throw some light on how this erasure was brought about? Also, how far is this idea of Saanjha Punjab a diasporic, nostalgic creation of the past? That's the first question.
Thank you. I think it really has very, very deep connotations for women's sexuality and their power in society. And I would like to connect the lusty songs to the power which courtesans as a class had in colonial Punjab. We know the courtesans of Lucknow and Awadh were very famous, and Banaras, so the UP part. But similarly in Lahore and Punjab, Amritsar and Lahore, the courtesans were very wealthy, very learned, and very very skilled musicians and dancers. And this kind of it reached its apogee with Ranjit Singh, and then with this sort of the launch of this Victorian kind of social morality of being chaste women. What is a chaste woman? These courtesans were lumped together as prostitutes and were seen as women of questionable character. And along with that, there was this attempt to reform middle class women, upper caste women, or women from these sort of respectable quote unquote backgrounds for their music to also change. So the Sitanis, which would make innuendo laden comments on the groom's family, were now changed to the tune was retained. So the melody of the Sitani was retained, but the tune was the lyrics were changed to a bhajan, in a bhajan format, or singing a praise to God. So this is how they kind of rework the cultural memory. Is that? I hope I've answered the question.
Thank you for that, Rabina. Moving on, question from Mr. Clicks. Thank you for the discussion. Radha, I was wondering if you have come across any narratives about the Pakavajis that performed during Maharaja Ranjit Singh's reign, and there's a follow-up to that. In addition, could you point to any sources that discuss prominent Kirtankars in the Lahore Darbar? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'm afraid I didn't go specifically looking for Kirtankars or Pakavajis. I was looking at this entire rubric of musicians and dancers. But Kirit Singh, who is doing his PhD at SOAS right now, on the Mardana project, is one of his interests. So he has a lot of information on the Sikh Kirtankars at Ranjit Singh's court. Bhai Baldeep Singh has interviewed people from his own family who claim descent from people who performed at Ranjit Singh's court. So there is this Naiyan da Gharana, which is known as the Baba's Gharana of music. And so and Bhai Baldeep Singh claims that it was this Amritsari Baj of Pakhavaj, which was patronized for the first time by Ranjit Singh, and it sort of dates its origins from that period. So that's all I can say. But the other thing is that there are treatises on music which survive from that time, which were transcribed during Ranjit Singh's period. So there was a lot of activity on music, very serious engagement with music. Yeah.
I will add to that. I will be in discussion with Jasdeep Singh, a Geordie player from the UK, who has co-founded the Madonna Project. That will be on Saturday. So Mr. Fix or anyone else who's interested in the book Harvard, specifically that question that you asked, if you could join that one, I'll share the details, but I will be in conversation with Jasdeep, who is a jury sort of exponent in the UK. Let's move on, we've got a couple more minutes. Thank you from Harfateh, amazing chat. For a lot of us in the West, Saanjha Punjab may be about nostalgia, but so many of us from both sides get together and bond over language, food, music and cricket too. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I agree with that. Amandeep, thank you for the conversation, very enjoyable. I'm curious if 200 years of the British in India led to any meaningful influence in British music, in the same way that language and food have entered the way that we talk and what we eat. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I think, I don't think there has been a similar level of impact on British music and culture, though I think it needs further research. So this is just my tentative guess. Certainly there were loads of people, like there was a Scottish Mem Sahib who learnt music in rural Punjab from the Mirasis. Anne Wilson, you know, she learned music from the Mirasis and she was trained by them. She learned classical music from them. So there are these instant stories of encounters. And then Lahore was a sort of image, a trope, which inspired, there was an opera written, Le Roi de Lahore. So in some senses, it entered the imagination of people in the West. But I don't think musically, but that this, as I said, this is me being ignorant. And I'm sure there is a musicologist or expert out there who will perhaps say I'm wrong. But to the extent that Western instruments and Western music impacted India, but at the same time, it didn't upturn the centuries-old kind of system of oral transmission of music. So even today, if you need to be a serious classical musician, you cannot learn it through written notation or through going to degree school like you go to the Trinity College. It's not the same. It's an old Guru Shishya, Ustad Shagird parampara.
Yeah, you need the guru to, you know, to guide you. You need to have that person, the physical person in front of you. I know how important that is as well. It's not the same. And that tradition, the Guru Shishya parampara, is passing it down, not having notations. You know, I'm used to that as someone as a musician when I was young, having notations. But as I was venturing into learning different genres of music, and for example, I had to learn by ear, I had to train my ear. And I found that really difficult. We're used to notation. Very difficult. And that just shows you, you know, the amount of time and effort invested in these traditions. And it's sad that they sort of, they were impacted in the way that they were. But like we mentioned throughout the conversation, Madonna Project, for example, is just one that comes to mind. I'm sure there's many more that are trying to revive, you know, the classical music of undivided Punjab.
And the thing is that, you know, the reason this was so popular in undivided Punjab, you know, there are stories of peasants showing up in droves for classical music concerts like the Harballabh. And so there was a sense in which Drupad, in fact, you mentioned Drupad was the most popular genre in Punjab, and Punjab was a center of Drupad singing. And the Harballabh festival in Jalandhar started as a Drupad festival, and it had a huge audience. So in a sense, it's so popular, but with this modernity and the khayal being shorter and being more suited to recording as a genre, it sort of replaced these old forms. So it's also about cultivating audiences, I think.
I've just got a timer telling me we've got 20 seconds left. So I think we will leave it here because we've got all the questions. So it's a pleasure. It was a pleasure, Radha, that you were able to join us. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. If anyone has any questions, please give Radha Kapuria a follow and ask your questions there. We've got 5 seconds left. So I'm just going to leave it here and say thank you again. Have a good evening.